The summer of 1972 arrived in Munich wearing a particular kind of light, the long golden afternoons of a Bavarian August that softened the edges of the city's Baroque architecture and coaxed people into the beer gardens and along the banks of the Isar. After nearly 3 decades of rebuilding, of processing catastrophe, of negotiating a new national identity from the rubble of the worst regime in modern European history, West Germany had arrived at a moment it intended to use well. The 1972 Summer Olympics were not simply a sporting event to the government and people who had spent 6 years preparing for them. They were a statement, a declaration about the kind of country West Germany had become. The choice of Munich as host city had been made in 1966. Almost immediately, the organizing committee began working with the intention of making this the most deliberately welcoming and open games in the Olympic movement's history. Graphic designer O.T.L. Eicher created a visual identity built on soft curves and gentle color, blues, greens, and warm golds that spoke of movement and joy, rather than the monumental severity that had defined the 1936 Berlin Games under a very different German government. The Olympic Park that rose from the former Oberwiesenfeld airfield in the city's northern suburbs offered sweeping, transparent roof structures and open green spaces designed at human scale. Every design choice an implicit argument against the stone grandeur of Albert Speer. Officials limited the visible security presence inside the Olympic Village deliberately, rejecting suggestions for more prominent armed guards on the grounds that armed men at the gates would undermine precisely the message they were trying to send. These would be the carefree games, die Heiter and Spiel. The phrase was not accidental. 121 nations sent athletes to Munich. Nearly 8,000 competitors occupied the residential complex built for them north of the Olympic Stadium. A city within a city that functioned for 2 weeks as something genuinely unusual in the world of 1972. A place where Americans and Soviets ate breakfast in the same cafeteria, where East and West Germans competed under the same roof, where the roving, weightless feeling that athletics generates at its best filled every communal space. Mark Spitz had already won 7 gold medals in the swimming events by the first days of September, each victory broadcast to an estimated global television audience that dwarfed any previous Olympic coverage. Olga Korbut had charmed the gymnastics competition into a spectacle that made front pages worldwide. The Games were delivering exactly the spectacle of human grace and international goodwill that their organizers had promised. The Israeli delegation had arrived on August 21st, 2 weeks before everything changed. There were 11 of them. They came from different backgrounds, represented different sports, and had traveled different roads to reach Munich, but they shared the particular quality of people who had grown up in a country that had existed for only 24 years and had been tested by war 3 separate times within those years. Israel had fought in 1948 to establish its independence, in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, and in 1967 in the Six-Day War that reshaped the geography of the Middle East in under a week of fighting. The Israeli athletes and coaches who arrived in Munich that August carried this history the way people from their generation did. Not as daily burden but as permanent context, the background against which even the act of standing on an Olympic competition floor had meaning beyond the score. Moshe Weinberg led the wrestling program. He was 33 years old, compact and powerful in the way of men built by a lifetime on gymnasium mats, with a laugh loud enough to carry down hallways and a habit of holding court at the dinner table that made the younger athletes orbit him naturally. His wife Miriam was at home with their infant son. He had mailed postcards from Munich describing the food and the architecture and the particular suspended reality of being somewhere the rest of the world also happened to be, all at once, for reasons having nothing to do with conflict. Yosef Romano was the weightlifter, born in Libya and raised in Israel, whose wide-open face and genuine warmth made him look younger than his 32 years. He had competed in front of audiences in countries that did not recognize the flag he lifted under. He did it here too, in front of crowds that cheered without condition, and he received the applause the way he received everything, directly and without ceremony. Yaakov Springer was 52, the weightlifting referee, a Holocaust survivor who had rebuilt his life across 3 decades and arrived here as the representative of a nation that had not existed when the worst thing that could happen to a person had happened to him. André Spitzer coached fencing. He was 27 years old, Dutch-born and gentle-mannered, and he had married a woman named Ankie, Rekes the previous year. Anki was in the final months of pregnancy. They had argued before his departure about whether the timing was right, whether his coaching schedule was compatible with fatherhood. It was an ordinary argument. They had agreed to finish it when he returned. David Berger held dual American and Israeli citizenship. Mark Slavin had turned 18 years old that year, the youngest member of the delegation, a wrestler who had emigrated from the Soviet Union and taken to his new country with the enthusiasm of someone who had chosen it rather than been simply born into it. Eliezer Halfin was 24, another wrestler, small and precise. Amitzer Shapira coached track and field. Kahat Shor coached shooting. Zeev Friedman was a weightlifter, dark-haired and focused. These are their names. Whatever follows in this story requires that they be named first, individually, so that they are not simply a number or a collective abstraction. 11 people came to Munich with the Israeli delegation. 11 people did not come home. Their apartments were on the second and third floors of Building 31 on Kanalstrasse, a quiet residential street in the southern section of the Olympic Village. The building was unremarkable in the way of purpose-built temporary housing, functional and modest, with the particular anonymous quality of spaces designed to be occupied briefly by thousands of different people across a continuous succession of events. September 4th had been a Monday. Some Israeli events were already complete. Others still lay ahead. The atmosphere in the Israeli quarters that evening was the quiet satisfaction of people settling into the rhythms of somewhere they had worked very hard to reach. What none of them knew was that their apartment building had been under surveillance by an 8-man team for several weeks prior. The organization that would attack them was called Black September, named for the month in 1970 when Jordanian King Hussein's army had crushed the Palestinian Liberation Organization's military presence in Jordan, killing thousands of Palestinian fighters and civilians and expelling the remainder to Lebanon. The event had been traumatic and radicalizing for an entire generation of Palestinian fighters, and Black September had been formed from its aftermath as the operational militant arm of the PLO. Deniable enough that PLO chairman Yasser Arafat could publicly disavow its actions while privately understanding what they were for. In the 2 years since its founding, Black September had assassinated the Jordanian prime minister, attacked an oil pipeline in the Netherlands, and conducted operations across multiple European cities. But Munich was different in scale, ambition, and intended audience. The operation had been planned for months by Ali Hassan Salameh, Black September's operations chief. Salameh was 30 years old, darkly handsome, the son of a Palestinian commander killed in the 1948 war, and he had been trained in explosives and operations in Egypt and the Soviet Union. He understood with clarity that the Munich Olympics offered something no border conflict or targeted assassination could provide. A platform watched simultaneously by hundreds of millions of people, a stage on which the word Palestinian would be spoken in every living room on earth within hours. He had designed the Munich operation for that audience. 8 men arrived in Munich in the days before the attack, traveling separately on different flights with different documentation. Their identities were later published in the West German Inquiry. Ludif Afif, who called himself Isa and served as leader, Yusuf Nazal, Afif Ahmed Hamid, Khalid Jawad, Ahmed Sheikhda, Mohammed Safadi, Adnan Al-Ghashi, and Jamal Al-Ghashi. At least 2 of them had attended Olympic events the previous evening as legitimate spectators, moving through the crowds with the ease of people who had spent weeks learning to look like they belonged. They had acquired the access codes and layout details of the village from an informant embedded in the catering operation. Their weapons, Kalashnikov assault rifles and hand grenades, had been smuggled into Germany in advance and were waiting for them. At 4:10 in the morning on September 5, 1972, they gathered at the chain-link perimeter fence on the southern edge of the Olympic Village. The sky above them was the particular shade of dark blue that appears in the last 30 minutes before dawn, when the stars are still visible but night has already lost its full authority. They wore tracksuits. They carried sports bags. Several West German athletes returning from a late evening at the village nightclub reportedly encountered them at the fence and helped them over, assuming they were competitors sneaking back after curfew. The investigators who documented this detail later described it with the bleak specificity of people trying to convey something that had stopped being explicable the moment it became real. The 8 men dropped to the ground on the far side of the fence and moved through the dark toward Kanalstrasse 31. Moshe Weinberg came to his apartment door when sounds in the corridor reached him that did not belong to the building at 4 in the morning. What he saw on the other side of the door transformed him almost instantly from a sleeping man into something else. A person who understood with an athletic immediacy what was happening, and whose response in those first seconds shaped how many of his colleagues survived the next several hours. He shouted. He attacked. He took a bullet in the face that did not put him down, and he used the time and noise he had created to steer the men with guns away from the apartment where the largest group slept, guiding them deliberately wrong through hallways he knew better than they did. Several Israeli athletes and coaches escaped through windows in the chaos those moments generated. Yosef Romano also fought back when the attackers came for him. He was shot and killed. Moshe Weinberg was used as a guide through the building by his captors. He died of his wounds before dawn. By 5 in the morning, 9 Israelis were bound and held in the rooms of Building 31. The Olympic Village was beginning to stir. Somewhere a few hundred meters away, athletes were rising for early training sessions. The communal kitchens were starting their first preparations. The sky was lightening over Munich. The carefree games were over. The first images reached television audiences worldwide within an hour of when Moshe Weinberg had come to his apartment door. Camera operators positioned on rooftops and upper floors of buildings surrounding the Olympic Village captured footage that the global broadcast infrastructure assembled for the games transmitted almost immediately. A figure in a white hat leaning from the balcony of Kanalstrasse 31, scanning the street below with the deliberate efficiency of someone taking inventory. The man was Lutif Afif. The white hat would become one of the decade's most haunting images, shorthand for an event that had broken the Olympic movement's fundamental premise, that sport could, for 2 weeks out of every 4 years, exist outside the world's ordinary violence. The demands were conveyed to West German authorities by 9:30 in the morning. Black September wanted 234 Palestinian and Arab prisoners released from Israeli jails, including Kozo Okamoto, a Japanese Red Army operative who had survived the Lod airport massacre 3 months earlier, in which 26 civilians had been killed at Ben Gurion Airport on Black September's behalf. The list also included 2 West German prisoners connected to the Red Army faction. The original deadline for compliance was 9 in the morning, already passed. Extensions were granted through the day as West German officials scrambled to build a response to a situation for which no protocol existed. Israel's answer came through back channels and then through official statements shortly after. There would be no release. Not one prisoner would be freed in response to a gun held against a hostage's head. This was not obstinacy. It was a principle that Israeli governments had encoded into their doctrine precisely because any other answer would confirm hostage-taking as a viable and repeatable tactic for extracting political concessions. Golda Meir consulted her cabinet. The decision was reached without dissent. The Israeli negotiators in Munich were authorized only to forestall, to create time, not to offer substance. For the next 12 hours, West German Interior Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher and Munich Police Chief Manfred Schreiber attempted to manage a crisis for which West Germany had neither the doctrine nor the capability they would have needed to manage it well. Genscher entered Building 31 personally and offered himself as a substitute hostage. Issa, the Black September commander, refused. Egyptian Olympic officials were brought in to serve as intermediaries. Wealthy Arab interlocutors offered ransoms through various channels. None of it moved the attackers. They were operating on a fixed timeline designed before any of these conversations began, adjusting nothing of substance while maintaining the appearance of negotiation long enough to ensure their global visibility reached its maximum extent. Throughout the day, the International Olympic Committee made a decision that drew immediate and sustained condemnation from multiple delegations and has remained a subject of moral debate ever since. President Avery Brundage and the IOC voted to suspend competition briefly, hold a memorial service, and then resume the games. Events continued in other areas of the Munich complex while 9 Israeli citizens sat bound in apartments a short walk from the competition venues. Israeli officials were appalled. The families watching the crisis unfold on television in Israel were appalled. What looked from the stadium like the appropriate continuation of international sport looked, from Kanalstrasse, like a statement about whose lives the Olympic movement considered worth interrupting its schedule. By late afternoon, the West German government had settled on a plan. It was the only plan they had, developed under severe time pressure, based on limited intelligence about the attackers' capabilities and character, and relying on resources that turned out to be badly insufficient for what the plan required. The essence of it was this: the West Germans would pretend to accept the demand for transport to Cairo, move the hostages and their captors to an airbase outside Munich, and use the controlled environment of the airfield to conduct an ambush. The airbase selected was Fürstenfeldbruck, 30 kilometers west of Munich. A Lufthansa Boeing 727 was placed on the tarmac in Cairo destination configuration. West German police and pilot and crew uniforms were positioned on board to simulate the flight crew and to initiate the ambush from inside the aircraft once the attackers entered to inspect it. Sharpshooters were positioned on rooftops and in the darkness around the tarmac. Everything about this plan depended on execution that was, in retrospect, several years of specialized counterterrorism training beyond what the people executing it actually had. There were 5 sharpshooters. None of them had been provided body armor. None of them had sniper-grade rifles calibrated for night shooting. None of them had radios that allowed real-time coordination with each other or with the command post. They had been given no target assignments specifying which of the 8 attackers each was responsible for. The basic arithmetic of the situation: 8 armed men moving unpredictably across an open tarmac in darkness, 5 shooters without communication, and 9 bound hostages among the targets, did not add up to a successful ambush under the best professional conditions, and these were not those conditions. The West German police officers disguised as crew inside the Lufthansa aircraft added a complication that unraveled what remained of the plan. Positioned in the aircraft cabin, waiting for the attackers to board, those officers held a vote among themselves and decided to leave the plane before the helicopters arrived. They were not trained for close-quarters combat. They had not been told what would happen if things went wrong in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. They walked down the boarding stairs and crossed to the terminal building, taking with them the one element of the plan that might have functioned: a controlled ambush inside the aircraft upon entry. 2 helicopters had transported the 9 hostages, their 8 captors, and several West German negotiators from the Olympic Village to Fürstenfeldbruck at approximately 10:30 in the evening. The journey itself was tense and slow, the transfer conducted under the eye of cameras, and with the awkward choreography of people navigating an impossible situation. At the airbase, Isa and one other Black September operative walked to the aircraft to inspect it. They found it empty. They walked back toward the helicopters. What happened next took place in the darkness of the tarmac at shortly after 11 in the evening. One of the German sharpshooters opened fire, apparently without the agreed signal from the command post. What followed was not a coordinated operation but a prolonged, chaotic exchange in which the tactical situation fractured immediately and never recovered. From the command post, commanders could see almost nothing clearly. From the rooftop positions, the shooters had overlapping fields of fire without coordination. The attackers took cover behind and beneath the helicopters, using the aircraft as shields that also held the hostages. The firefight lasted over an hour. During it, one attacker threw a hand grenade into the cabin of the first helicopter. The explosion and the fuel ignition that followed killed all the hostages inside instantly. In the second helicopter, another attacker turned his Kalashnikov on the bound hostages lying on the floor and fired at close range. West German police officer Anton Fliegerbauer was killed in the exchange of fire. By the time the shooting ended, 3 of the 8 attackers had been captured. 5 were dead. All 9 Israeli hostages were dead. At midnight, an announcement was broadcast by West German authorities that the operation had been successful and that the hostages were safe. It was based on an honest misreading of the situation in the immediate chaos of the aftermath. For approximately an hour, the world believed that the crisis had ended with everyone alive. Jim McKay, the American broadcaster covering the games for ABC, had been on air continuously for most of the 18 hours since the attack began. He had been feeding information to an audience of tens of millions through a day of near-constant uncertainty, reading updates as they arrived, maintaining a professional composure that the circumstances made almost incomprehensible. When the full picture finally came through, he delivered the words that his name became permanently attached to: "They're all gone." The bodies were flown back to Israel on the morning of September 6th. The 11 individual men who had arrived in Munich 2 weeks earlier as athletes and coaches came home in coffins. Their funerals would be held across the country in the days that followed. The Olympic Games would resume. Avery Brundage would deliver a memorial speech that spent more time discussing the threat to the Olympic movement than the people who had just been killed, a speech that drew expressions of outrage from multiple delegations and that stands today as one of the more extraordinary exercises in institutional self-absorption in the history of international sport. 3 Black September operatives were alive in West German custody. The world did not yet know how briefly they would remain there. What the world did know, watching from living rooms and bars and embassy briefing rooms across every continent, was that something had been done that could not be undone, and that whoever was responsible for it, wherever they were that night, had chosen to remain alive and unaccountable in a world that was now deciding what, if anything, it intended to do about that. The decision being made in Jerusalem was already forming. It would take several more weeks to become operational, and several more decades to play out fully. But the thread that would eventually run from Fürstenfeldbruck to a car-bomb street in Beirut and a shot man in a Roman apartment lobby and a Norwegian courtroom had already been pulled tight on the night of September 5th, in the darkness above a West German airfield, among the wreckage of helicopters and the wreckage of 11 lives and the wreckage of a version of the world that had briefly seemed possible. The 11 coffins arrived at Lod Airport on the morning of September 6th under a sky that Israel's geography made cruel in its contrast. Clean blue, warm with the particular Mediterranean light that the country had in September, the kind of morning that ordinarily made the coastal plain look like something worth fighting for. The airport was silent in the way that large spaces become silent when filled with mourning people who understand that words are not adequate and do not attempt them. The families stood where they had been guided by officials and waited for the sight of flag-draped boxes being unloaded from the belly of the LL aircraft, each one representing a specific person with a specific name and a specific life cut away at its center. Ankie Spitzer, 26 years old and 8 months pregnant, had watched the events in Munich unfold on a television in her home in the Netherlands. She had stayed on the phone through much of the night with Israeli officials who were themselves not always certain what was happening. The announcement of a successful rescue had reached her like the end of a nightmare. Then the correction had arrived. Her daughter Anouk would be born several weeks later and would grow up knowing her father through what Ankie kept and recorded and eventually made into several decades of persistent, dignified advocacy. Miriam Weinberg had an infant son named Guri. Ilana Romano had 3 daughters. The widows and the families stood at the airport and received what was brought back to them, which was not enough. 300,000 people lined the streets of Tel Aviv when the state cortege passed. Schools had been dismissed. Flags flew at half-mast across the country. The 11 funerals took place over several days, each one attended by officials and civilians and the specific community of people who had known that individual person. The neighbors, the peers from the sports associations, the coaches and athletes and friends who had sometimes driven hours to stand at a cemetery and do the only formal thing available to them. Prime Minister Golda Meir delivered the official address at the state ceremony held before the individual funerals. She was 64 years old. She had delivered official addresses before at national moments of grief, which was not rare in Israel's 24-year history, and she had learned across those occasions to control her voice and her face while the words she chose did the work they were supposed to do. She spoke about the men who had died and about Israel's determination to exist in a world that seemed to require constant proof of that determination. Her voice did not break. Those who had known her for decades said they could see something change in her face during that ceremony. Not collapse, not visible grief, but a settling of something that had already been decided before the camera caught it. The response from the international community took several forms, and nearly all of them fell short of what Israel expected. The United Nations Security Council convened to discuss the massacre and could not produce a consensus condemnation. The Soviet Union and China refused any statement that did not simultaneously address Israeli military operations in Palestinian territories. Arab governments offered responses ranging from official regret to barely disguised celebration. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi praised the operation publicly. The Palestinian leadership declined to condemn it. The 3 Black September operatives in West German custody awaited trial, though Israeli intelligence services monitoring European legal systems had already assessed that the prospects of long imprisonment were, at best, uncertain. West Germany was in an uncomfortable position that the government handled with the diplomatic awkwardness of a country managing 2 competing embarrassments simultaneously. The embarrassment of having failed to protect the Israeli athletes was genuine. The embarrassment of what to do with the 3 surviving attackers was more complicated. West Germany had abolished the death penalty under its post-war constitution. Life imprisonment was the maximum sentence available. The political climate in several European governments in 1972, particularly regarding Palestinian militant activity, was characterized by a reluctance to apply the full force of criminal law to people whose political grievances, however violently expressed, were considered by many European voices to reflect genuine injustices. On October 29, 1972, 54 days after the Munich massacre, a Lufthansa Boeing 727 aircraft operating Flight 615 between Beirut and Ankara was hijacked by 2 men who identified themselves as members of Black September. They issued a single demand: the release of the 3 Munich survivors from West German custody. The West German government agreed immediately. The 3 men were flown to Libya and received there publicly as heroes. Israeli intelligence officers who had been monitoring the developing situation described their reaction in terms that varied between cold fury and the grim satisfaction of having been proven right about something they wished they had been wrong about. The speed with which West Germany complied, without negotiation, without significant resistance, without even the formality of extended deliberation, confirmed what the more pessimistic analysts had been arguing since Munich: that the surviving Black September operatives in West German hands were always going to be released eventually, that the German government's principal desire was to be free of the political complications their imprisonment created, and that the hijacking had been an arranged opportunity rather than a genuine threat. Aaron J. Klein, drawing on Israeli intelligence sources in his 2005 history of the period, cited officials who believed the entire Lufthansa operation had been choreographed in advance with at least the tacit knowledge of some element of the German government. The German government denied this. The men were free regardless. In Jerusalem, the implications were processed quickly and without illusion. The mechanism that existed to hold the planners and perpetrators of Munich accountable, the criminal justice systems of Western European nations, had demonstrated within 2 months of the massacre that it was not a reliable mechanism. Political pressure, diplomatic complexity, and the specific character of several European governments' relationships with Palestinian factions meant that the courts of ordinary law were not going to accomplish what was needed. The argument that had been building in Golda Meir's security cabinet since September was now supported by the most direct possible evidence that waiting for other institutions to act produced not justice but release flights to Tripoli. Germany's formal investigation into the Munich disaster produced a report that was thorough, careful, and honest about the operational failures at Fürstenfeldbruck. The sharpshooters had been inadequately trained and equipped. Communication had broken down at multiple points. The decision to remove the police crew from the aircraft had been made below the level of command authority that should have controlled it. The premature ceasefire announcement had prevented a response that might have altered the outcome. The report also noted, though with more diplomatic restraint, that warnings about potential attacks on the Israeli delegation had existed and had not been acted upon with sufficient urgency. The German government's acknowledgement of these failures, while genuine, provided no comfort to the families of the dead. Ankie Spitzer would spend the next 5 decades pursuing acknowledgement and documentation of what had happened to her husband and the other 10 men, fighting at various times with Israeli governments, with German governments, with the International Olympic Committee, and with the machinery of diplomatic ambiguity that surrounded the events of September 1972 like insulation around something too hot to touch. In 2022, 50 years after the massacre, Germany formally acknowledged state responsibility and announced a compensation agreement with the victim families. It had taken half a century and the sustained effort of widows and children to extract that acknowledgement from the institutions that owed it. But in the autumn of 1972, none of that was yet in sight. What was in sight was the specific and practical question of what Israel intended to do, given that the world had made its answer about international accountability sufficiently clear. Golda Meir had been asking that question since September 6th and had been arriving at an answer that her security cabinet, her intelligence chiefs, and her own 30 years of experience with the world as it actually functioned were all pointing her toward. The committee that would authorize the next phase of Israel's response was already forming. The men who would carry the response into practice were already being considered. And the list of names that would guide the operation, the planners, the financiers, the handlers who built and supplied the network that killed 11 Israeli citizens in Munich, was already being assembled from the intelligence files of an organization that had been watching Palestinian militant activity in Western Europe for several years and knew rather more than it had yet acted on. What came next would happen quietly, without press releases or official acknowledgments. It would take place in the ordinary spaces of ordinary European cities, in apartment lobbies and on public streets and in hotel rooms, over a period that would eventually span 2 decades. It would kill some of the right people and at least one catastrophically wrong one. It would generate a diplomatic crisis in Scandinavia, a murder trial in Norway, and a body of intelligence doctrine that governments around the world are still arguing about. It would end or come close to ending with a car bomb on a street in Beirut facing the sea. And it would permanently change the relationship between the Israeli state, its intelligence services, and the moral questions that every government eventually confronts when it decides that the world's failure to act has created a vacancy that only it can fill. The question that Golda Meir faced in the weeks following Munich was one she could articulate very precisely, even when she chose not to articulate it publicly. It was not a question about whether the men who had planned and supported the massacre deserved to face consequences. That part was not genuinely in dispute. It was a question about mechanism, what structure existed in the world to deliver those consequences, and if that structure was absent or unreliable, what Israel was prepared to do about its absence. Meir had been born in Kiev in 1898, in the Russian Empire, in a neighborhood where the organized killing of Jewish communities by their neighbors and their police was not a historical abstraction but a documented, cyclically recurring fact of the local environment. Her family had emigrated to the United States when she was 8, settling in Milwaukee, and America had given her safety and education, and eventually a channel for the political ambitions that had been developing in her since childhood. But she had chosen to build her life in Israel, and in the 40 years between her commitment to Zionism and her arrival as Prime Minister, she had watched very carefully what happened when a Jewish government did and did not respond to violence against its people. Munich, in this framework, was not a new category of event. It was a new instance of a category she had studied for decades. By the first weeks of October 1972, discussions in the closed sessions of her Security and Foreign Affairs Cabinet had narrowed toward a conclusion. The conversations were not simple and they were not performance. Arguments were examined from multiple directions with the kind of seriousness that people bring to decisions they understand cannot be reversed. Those present included Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, whose combat biography across every major Israeli conflict gave him a particular authority in assessing military and paramilitary operations. Chief of Staff David Elazar, Mossad Director Zvi Zamir, and Shin Bet Chief Joseph Harmelin were present in various configurations across these meetings. Several legal advisors attended sessions where the international law questions were being worked through with precision. The argument against targeted assassinations was not that the targets were innocent. The intelligence picture Mossad had assembled in the weeks since Munich identified with considerable confidence the key members of Black September's planning and support structure in Western Europe and the Arab world. These were not misidentified civilians. They were operational figures whose involvement in the Munich attack ranged from direct planning to logistical support to command authorization. The arguments against killing them were practical and strategic rather than moral. That operating in foreign capitals without those governments' knowledge damaged relationships with European allies at a strategic moment. That it set a precedent for extrajudicial killing that could be weaponized against Israel in the international courts of opinion. That it might accelerate rather than deter future operations by pushing Black September to demonstrate it could not be intimidated. These were serious arguments. They were heard. They were ultimately insufficient to override what the people in the room understood to be the alternative. Doing nothing meaningful while the surviving network continued planning future operations, and while every organization watching this series of events absorbed the lesson that killing Israelis carried no personal cost for those who ordered it. The release of the 3 Munich survivors from West Germany 2 months after the massacre crystallized this calculus with a directness that the most pessimistic analysts had been predicting. Zvi Zamir had been Mossad's director since 1968. He was not a man given to theatrical responses, but he had been present at Fürstenfeldbruck on the night of September 5th, observing the West German operation from an advisory position, watching through darkness and distance as it produced exactly the outcome he had assessed it would produce. He had flown home from Munich carrying an operational conclusion about what waiting for other governments to protect Israeli citizens produced. His briefing to the Prime Minister in October laid out the target list and the operational parameters with the specific, professional clarity of someone who had been preparing this presentation since the morning of September 6th. The committee that was formed to oversee what came next went by no official title in any paper that was declassified for public review. Israeli intelligence historians have called it variously the Committee of X, the Committee on Operations, or the Wrath of God Committee, the last term being a retroactive label applied by journalists and historians rather than used by the people involved. What it functioned as was a small, deniable oversight group composed of senior Mossad figures, select cabinet ministers and intelligence advisors, a structure specifically designed to maintain political authorization for operations while keeping the chain of explicit government responsibility short enough to preserve plausible deniability in the event of exposure. Similar structures have been documented in various forms in the intelligence histories of other Western democracies facing similar dilemmas, though few have been as directly focused on targeted killing as this one was. The legal architecture the committee inhabited was genuinely unusual and has remained a subject of serious debate in international law scholarship ever since. Israel was not in a state of formally declared war with Black September or the PLO. The targets were not uniformed soldiers of a recognized enemy state. Killing them in the European capitals where they lived and operated was, under any straightforward application of international law, a series of premeditated killings on the territory of countries whose governments had neither been consulted nor given permission. The committee understood this. The arguments available for framing the operations as lawful, extending the concept of active defense against an ongoing security threat, applying the laws of armed conflict to an unconventional enemy, were argued by legal advisors who also, presumably, understood that they were advocacy rather than settled doctrine. The decision to proceed despite this was made with full awareness of what it meant. Meir has spoken about this general category of decision in her 1975 memoir, My Life, in terms that acknowledge the weight without providing operational detail. She described the period following Munich as one requiring acceptance that living in the world as it actually functions demands decisions that a purely theoretical morality would not permit. The people in the rooms where these decisions were made had come up through a history that had taught this lesson more forcefully than most. Mossad's operational capability for what was being contemplated resided in its Caesarea division, the department responsible for what intelligence organizations variously call direct action, special operations, or, in the cleaner vocabulary of people who did not work there, assassination. Caesarea was not the organization's largest division. It was staffed principally by officers who could operate for extended periods in foreign countries undercover, making consequential decisions without headquarters support in environments where the distance between success and exposure was measured in the quality of split-second judgment. The man Zamir assigned to lead the operational planning was Mike Harari, formerly Rami Harari, the head of Caesarea, a compact and meticulous man in his late 40s whose career across 3 decades of sensitive operations had included work on the intelligence infrastructure that had tracked Adolf Eichmann from Buenos Aires to the Israeli courtroom where he was convicted and hanged. Harari understood the experience of pursuing a target across years and borders with incomplete information and a hostile operating environment. Munich gave him a mission different in character from the Eichmann operation, multiple targets, execute rather than capture, but the foundational professional skills were ones he had been accumulating since the 1950s. Harari received his mandate in a private meeting with Zamir. The parameters were explicit. Targets would be drawn from confirmed members of Black September's operational and logistical hierarchy. Individuals whose involvement in Munich or in ongoing operational planning could be verified by intelligence. Killing was to be accomplished in ways designed to minimize risk to uninvolved civilians. Operations were to be conducted without public claim of responsibility, maintaining the deniability that protected the political chain above the operation. The financial and administrative structure supporting the team would be built to survive the exposure of any individual piece without the whole being traceable to the Israeli government. What Harari was being authorized to build was, by any description, a state-sponsored assassination program operating covertly across multiple foreign jurisdictions for an indefinite period. The plainness of that description was not lost on anyone involved in authorizing it. It is recorded in the various accounts and declassified fragments that have accumulated over the decades that these conversations were conducted with the gravity appropriate to what was being decided. Whether that gravity amounts to moral justification is a question that subsequent generations were left to argue, because the people who made the decision were finished arguing it by the time they left the room. The first target was already named. His file was on Harari's desk. The team that would act on it was being assembled. And somewhere in Rome, a man was buying groceries and walking home through streets he had walked 100 times before, unaware that the walks were almost over. The most detailed account of how the assassination team was assembled comes from a book that Israel has never officially confirmed and has never fully denied. Vengeance, published in 1984 by the Canadian author George Jonas, was based on extensive interviews conducted over several years with a man Jonas identified only as Avner, a former Mossad officer who claimed to have led the primary team responsible for the Munich operation's targeted killings. The man's true identity has been debated since the book appeared. Israeli officials have issued conflicting statements over the decades about whether such a team existed in the precise form Jonas described, and whether the man who sat for those interviews was who he claimed to be. What has never been successfully refuted is that the broad operational structure Jonas documented aligns with what intelligence historians were eventually able to verify through other sources. The book's specific details about individual operations match external records in ways that would be difficult to achieve through fabrication. Whatever the precise identity of the man who spoke to Jonas, someone spoke to him knowing the truth. According to that account, the leader was selected not for spectacular combat credentials, but for the specific combination of qualities that field command in a long-term covert operation actually requires. The capacity to make sound tactical decisions without headquarters support, the psychological stability to maintain a cover identity over months and years without the protection of institutional routine, the ability to lead a small group of different personalities toward a shared operational purpose without the scaffolding of rank and uniform that conventional military hierarchies provide. He was in his late 20s, married, with a child. The choice to send him was made in full awareness that sending him meant his family would lose him for months or years, that his wife would explain his absence to their child in whatever terms she found manageable, and that she would do this without being able to say why or for how long. The conversation in which Avner, as we will call him, received his briefing took place in a configuration that Mossad used for sensitive assignments. 2 meetings, separated by several days in different locations, the first establishing the scope and the second delivering the specific operational details. Harari delivered the parameters personally. Avner was told he was being asked to lead a team responsible for killing a series of individuals whose names and intelligence files he would receive in stages. Not all at once, not before they were needed, but as the operation progressed and the organizational picture remained current. He was told he would operate outside Israel for the duration. He was told that if things went wrong, the Israeli government would not acknowledge him. This was not meant cruelly. It was stated as operational fact, the parameter within which everything else would function. He was given time to consider it. He returned to his family's apartment, to the ordinary domestic architecture of a life he was already thinking about leaving behind, and he sat with the weight of what had been asked. The photographs of the 11 dead from Munich were in the newspapers that week. He had already seen them. He had seen them the way everyone in Israel had seen them, as specific people rather than a collective number, as faces that belonged to particular bodies and particular lives, as the specific human cost of a specific act of organized political violence for which no conventional legal mechanism was going to produce accountability. He accepted the assignment. The team he assembled, or that was assembled around him in the weeks that followed, comprised 5 core members whose individual specializations fitted together with the logic of a precision instrument. Each one brought a skill that the mission required and that none of the others could supply. Their names, in the account Jonas published, were Hans, Carl, Robert, Steve, and a woman referred to as Erica, though the individual called Erica was involved in a later phase and may represent a composite or a separate operation. For the initial phase of the mission, the working team was essentially 4 men and a leader. Hans was the explosives expert. He had been formally trained as a demolitions technician and could construct, adapt, or disable virtually any device he was likely to encounter in a West European context. He was methodical and unsentimental, the kind of professional whose effective relationship to his work was calibrated by precision rather than emotion. Carl was the documents man, the forger, the fabricator of false identities, who could produce clean passports from half a dozen countries, supporting documentation that survived scrutiny, and replacement papers in hours when circumstances required it. He had been doing this work for years and understood the specific vulnerabilities of every major Western country's documentation system. He was also, according to the intelligence file that Harari had assembled prior to October, and that the committee had reviewed and authorized action against, Black September's primary logistics contact in Italy. The specific intelligence against him included reports linking him to an LL flight bomb plot in August 1972, a device smuggled aboard an LL aircraft that failed to fully detonate. This remained the most direct connection documented in Israeli intelligence files, though the full picture of his role, as with most intelligence cases, contained elements of certainty, elements of strong probability, and elements that were inferences from circumstantial evidence. The committee had weighed the file and authorized the operation. The question of whether the case was strong enough by the standards one might apply in a courtroom, the evidentiary threshold, the opportunity for rebuttal, the presumption of innocence, was not the standard being applied. This was not a courtroom. The surveillance team had been watching Zweiter for approximately 3 weeks by the middle of October. His pattern of movement was reliably consistent. He left the Libyan embassy in the late afternoon, navigated the streets of central Rome in the methodical way of a man who knew them well and had nowhere to rush, stopped at a small grocery on the Via Trionfale where he purchased whatever he needed for the evening, and continued to his apartment building on Piazza Annibaliano. The building was a mid-century Roman residential structure, several floors, a ground-floor lobby with a small elevator and a staircase, the kind of building that was invisible in its ordinariness to everyone who did not live in it. October 16th was a Wednesday. The evening air over Rome held the particular quality of an Italian autumn, still warm enough to be pleasant outdoors, with just enough edge to remind you that summer had ended and that the season had changed to something more deliberate. Zweiter followed his normal route from the embassy, stopped at the grocery as expected, and arrived at his building on Piazza Annibaliano carrying a shopping bag. He had been to the cinema earlier in the week to see a film and had mentioned it to someone in the building who later told investigators that he had seemed his usual self, unhurried, untroubled by any particular awareness. He pushed through the door of his building's lobby. 2 men were waiting. They had entered the building in the minutes before his arrival using the standard approach of any resident or visitor, unexceptional in the lobby of a residential building, nothing marking them as other than what they appeared to be. When Zweiter entered, the distance between them closed in seconds. He was shot 12 times. He fell in the lobby and died there before any assistance arrived. The two men left the building and moved through the evening streets of Rome, separating after a prearranged distance, following the exit procedures that Robert had mapped in the preceding weeks. By the time Zweiter's body was discovered and the Italian police responded to the address, the team was already in transit. Rome had played its part in what would prove to be a long sequence. The city's police and intelligence services had no immediate answers about who had done this or why, though the PLO's office in Rome stated the following morning that an Israeli intelligence operation was responsible. Italian authorities publicly declined to draw that conclusion from the available evidence, though privately several of their analysts reached it quickly. The reaction from the PLO and from the various European circles in which Zweiter had moved was immediate and vocal. His friends and colleagues went to the press with their account of him. The poet, the translator, the literary intellectual, the man who had been working on an Arabic translation of 1001 Nights at the time of his death. The translation manuscript was found in his apartment beside the shopping bag he had been carrying when he was killed. This specific detail was reported widely in European newspapers and had a humanizing quality that shaped how certain political constituencies processed the killing. If this man was the face of the operation, those critics argued, then the operation was not precision justice but political assassination conducted on the basis of intelligence that no public court had vetted. The debate was not new and it was not wrong, exactly. But it was also not operating on all the available information, because the available information had been assembled by an organization that was not sharing it with the Italian press. The tension between the known and the not publicly known would run through every subsequent operation in this campaign, as it runs through every covert program. What the public can assess is always partial. What the partial picture includes depends on who is controlling the release. The second target was already identified by the time Zweiter was buried. His name was Mahmoud Hamshari, and he was the PLO's chief representative in France, operating from Paris with a profile considerably higher than Zweiter's had been in Rome. Hamshari was a more senior figure in the organization, known to European diplomats and politicians as a credible interlocutor on Palestinian issues, received in contexts where PLO representatives were treated as political figures rather than operatives. He was also, in Mossad's assessment, a central financial and organizational node for Black September's European operations, and had been specifically identified as having prior knowledge of and logistical involvement in the preparation for Munich. The Paris approach took longer and required a different method. Shooting someone of Hamshari's visibility in an apartment lobby in the same fashion as Zweiter would generate a response, diplomatic, political, investigative, that the team needed to manage carefully. The solution they developed demonstrated the technical capability that distinguished this program from ordinary criminal violence and marked it unmistakably as the product of a trained intelligence service. A technician on the team made contact with Hamshari under a cover identity, claiming to be an Italian journalist seeking an interview. The meeting occurred. During it, the team was able to survey the apartment and identify the specific telephone Hamshari used. When the opportunity arose, a device was installed beneath the telephone's base. A small explosive connected to the telephone line in a configuration that could be triggered by dialing Hamshari's number from a remote location. Robert was the logistics specialist, the man responsible for the unglamorous but essential architecture that kept an undercover team operational across multiple countries over an extended period. Safe houses, vehicles, communication equipment, emergency money caches, document drops, and escape routes from every city where an operation was conducted. If Avner was responsible for deciding what to do, Robert was largely responsible for ensuring that the infrastructure existed to do it. Steve was the surveillance and cleanup specialist, patient and methodical in observation work, capable of following a subject through a foreign city for days without establishing a recognized pattern, and responsible for the aftermath procedures that cleared operational traces before local police could act on them. They left Israel separately across several days on different flights, with clean documents that positioned them as nationals of different countries. Their cover identities were built with sufficient depth to survive routine professional scrutiny. They had histories, they had documentation, They had the particular details of biographical consistency that trained intelligence officers construct for long-term undercover work. They were not impenetrable legends, the kind that might survive intensive interrogation by a hostile intelligence service. They were working covers, adequate for the environment in which they would be operating, which was primarily the urban infrastructure of Western European cities where a businessman or academic or journalist with the right paperwork raised no automatic suspicion. Their financial support came through a structure designed to maintain maximum separation between the team's activities and any traceable connection to the Israeli government. Accounts in Swiss and Belgian banks held funds in names that had no intelligence fingerprints. Withdrawals were made in cash. The team maintained no patterns of recurring payment that could be cross-referenced across borders. Avner handled the financial administration himself, drawing on prearranged accounts through procedures he had memorized rather than written down. The discipline of accounting for every expenditure, which he maintained scrupulously even though no auditor would ever examine the books, was part of the broader discipline of operational security that had been drilled into him through training and that he understood, from the evidence of other operations that had failed, to be non-negotiable. The team did not meet collectively in any single place until the first operational phase was underway. They communicated through the cutout procedures that intelligence tradecraft specifies for exactly this kind of fragmented, distributed operation: pre-agreed contact times, fallback locations, code structures embedded in apparently innocuous communications. If one member was compromised, the communication architecture was designed to prevent the compromise from propagating through the rest of the team. In practice, these procedures were tested regularly by the simple friction of European city life. Missed connections, delayed travel, changed plans, and they held. The list of targets they were given was not comprehensive from the beginning. It was operational, meaning that it would be updated as intelligence developed and as the mission continued. The initial targets were the individuals whose connection to Munich was most clearly established and whose current locations in Western Europe made them most accessible. Names were added and occasionally removed as Mossad's assessment of the intelligence picture changed, as new information arrived through the networks of informants, intercepts, and agent reports that fed the organization's analysis divisions. The first name on the working list was a man living in Rome who worked at the Libyan embassy and who spent his evenings in the literary and cultural circles of the Italian capital. He had a girlfriend. He had a circle of intellectuals and artists who valued his company. He wrote poetry. He had also, according to intelligence assessments that Harari and Zamir considered reliable, played a significant operational role in Black September's logistics network in Western Europe and had been linked to an LL bomb plot earlier in 1972. The dual reality of a man who wrote poetry and coordinated bomb shipments was something the team would encounter again in various configurations as the years went on. It did not alter the decision that had already been made about him. His name was Wiles Wader. He lived in a residential apartment building on Piazza Annibaliano. He walked home most evenings from the Libyan embassy through the same streets, stopping at the same small grocery on the corner. He arrived at his building at predictable times and was known to the building's other residents as a quiet, pleasant neighbor. By the first weeks of October 1972, a team of Mossad officers had been watching him long enough to have that routine mapped. They were ready. Wiles Wader was 38 years old in October of 1972 and had been living in Rome for several years in the particular fashion of an educated Palestinian abroad, intellectually engaged, politically committed, socially embedded in the expatriate and literary circles of a city that had long been hospitable to both. He had been born in Nablus, studied in Baghdad, and arrived in Rome in the 1960s, where he had built a life that looked, from the outside, like the life of a working intellectual. He translated literature. He carried business cards that described him as a representative of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was not a secret. He frequented the cultural salons where Italian writers and European intellectuals gathered to discuss the politics of decolonization, the Palestinian question, the character of resistance movements, the moral frameworks that governed violent and nonviolent struggle. He had friends who were poets, journalists, academics. He had a girlfriend named Janet. He was gentle in his personal manner, bookish, the kind of person his acquaintances described in terms of warmth and wit. On December 8, 1972, 3 weeks before Christmas, the team placed a call to Hamshari's apartment from a phone box. When he answered and identified himself, a signal was sent that detonated the device beneath his telephone. Hamshari sustained catastrophic injuries and survived for approximately 1 month before dying in hospital on January 9, 1973. The investigation into the bombing by French police yielded no arrests and no official attribution, though French intelligence services formed a private view about its origin. The case formally remained open. 2 targets down in 2 capital cities in less than 6 weeks. The operation had found its rhythm. And the list, the document that the committee was updating regularly and Harari was receiving in stages, still had many names remaining. The winter of 1972 moving into the spring of 1973 was the most operationally intense period of the entire campaign's first phase, a stretch of months during which the team moved through European cities with the professional momentum of people who had found their operating rhythm and had not yet encountered anything capable of breaking it. Cyprus, France, Belgium, Spain. The geography of Mossad's pursuit in this period mapped the geography of Black September's European presence, which was itself a reflection of the broader Palestinian political diaspora distributed across the continent in the years following the expulsions from Jordan. Hussein al-Bashir was the 3rd man on the working list, and his killing took place not in Western Europe but in Nicosia, Cyprus on January 24, 1973. Al-Bashir was a senior member of the Black September network whose specific role has been described variously in different sources: intelligence coordinator, financial conduit, organizational intermediary, but whose presence on the list placed him in the category of figures whose elimination the committee considered operationally significant. He was staying in room 202 of the Hotel Nicosia Ambassador when the device planted under his mattress detonated in the early hours of the morning. The explosion destroyed the room and killed al-Bashir instantly. Cypriot police investigated. No arrests were made. 3 weeks later, on January 26th, a Mossad officer named Baruch Cohen was shot and killed in Madrid by a Black September operative. Cohen had been working undercover in Spain as part of the intelligence-gathering network feeding target information to the operation. His killing was a significant loss for the program and a demonstration that Black September was not passively absorbing the campaign against it. The organization had its own intelligence capability in Europe, and it was being used to identify and eliminate the Israeli presence. The operation had never been a simple one-directional hunt. It had always been a mutual and dangerous contest being conducted in civilian urban spaces among millions of uninvolved people. April of 1973 brought the killing of Basil al-Qabaisi in Paris. Al-Qabaisi was a professor of law at the American University of Beirut who also served as a Black September operative with primary responsibilities in logistics and weapons procurement, another of the dual lives that characterized several figures on the list, the academic or intellectual exterior housing an operational role in the organization. He was shot on a Paris street in the evening. 2 men fired multiple rounds and departed on foot into the darkness of the city. French authorities investigated and reached no public conclusion. Then came Mohamed Boudia, and with Boudia something shifted in the operational texture of the campaign, not in the method, which was a car bomb rather than a shooting, but in the specific quality of what Boudia represented as a target. Boudia was an Algerian-born theater director and political organizer who would become the principal coordinator of Black September's operations in France following Mahmoud Hamshari's death. He was a genuinely remarkable figure, dramatically gifted, politically sophisticated, personally compelling, and operationally expert. He had managed escape routes, laundered money, recruited operatives from the European radical left, and organized the logistical infrastructure for multiple Black September operations conducted in and through France. He was also, according to French security services who had been watching him for some time, very difficult to catch out in any detectable mistake. He changed apartments frequently, varied his routes, used multiple identities, and had an instinct for threat assessment that had kept him operational for years. He was killed on June 28, 1973, by a bomb placed under the seat of his car in the 6th arrondissement of Paris. He had begun his car, driven a short distance, and triggered the device, which killed him instantly and left the vehicle a burned wreck on a Parisian side street. His death represented a significant operational loss for Black September in France and required the organization to spend considerable time and resources rebuilding the French network from a much reduced position. It also, almost immediately, set in motion the appointment of a replacement who would prove both formidable and central to the operation's most consequential failure several weeks later. But before we continue into that darker chapter, if you're finding this story as gripping as we do at the Dead Drop, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss one of our deep dives into the world's most extraordinary espionage stories. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Your support genuinely keeps this channel going and helps us keep bringing you the stories that deserve to be told. By the summer of 1973, the campaign had killed at least 5 significant targets across 4 countries in 8 months. Mossad's operational pace had been remarkable both for its consistency and for what it had not yet generated. A catastrophic mistake, a diplomatic crisis, an exposure that could unravel the whole enterprise. Within the organization, this operational stretch was understood to demonstrate Caesarea's professional capability at its most effective. Outside the organization, within the European intelligence services that were privately forming their own conclusions about the pattern of killings, the assessment was similar. Whoever was doing this was very good. Black September's organizational response to the mounting losses was to escalate in several directions simultaneously. The appointment of Ali Hassan Salameh as operational deputy as the replacement for Boudia in France indicated that the organization was treating the European campaign as a priority secondary to nothing. Counter-surveillance efforts were intensified. Operatives in several Western European cities were warned that they were being watched and were advised to vary their routines and relocate if possible. The intelligence flow coming back to Harari and his analysts through the network of informants and intercepts that fed the operation was describing an organization that was frightened and adapting simultaneously, which was more dangerous, not less, than an organization simply frightened. The specific intelligence about Boudia's replacement led to a name. A man being described in the intercepts by various operational references but eventually identified by Mossad's analysts as connected to the planning structure in Western Europe. The intercepts pointed toward Scandinavia, specifically toward Norway, where reports described a senior operative traveling under alias. The name that crystallized in the intelligence product was Ali Hassan Salameh, the operational architect of Munich himself. If the intelligence was correct, the most important target on the entire list had surfaced in the safest-seeming corner of Europe, a country without a significant Palestinian presence, a country where no one would think to look. The intelligence was wrong. This would turn out to be the most consequential error of the entire operation, and it would happen not in the corridors of an intelligence headquarters but on the quiet streets of a Norwegian town, on a July evening in 1973, to a man who had never had anything to do with Munich, with Black September, or with any intelligence operation of any kind. His name was Ahmad Bouchiki. He was 35 years old, a Moroccan waiter living in Lillehammer, Norway, with his Norwegian wife Toril, who was pregnant with their child. He spent his evenings in the ordinary way of a working man in a quiet northern town. He paid for his ordinariness with his life, and in doing so, he ended the first phase of the operation more completely than anything Black September could have managed. What came next would unravel in a Norwegian police station, in an Oslo courtroom, and in the internal inquiry rooms of an organization that had prided itself on precision and was now confronting precisely the kind of failure that precision was supposed to prevent. The damage would be deep, lasting, and transformative, not because it destroyed the program but because it permanently altered how the program understood itself. In the spring of 1973, while the Paris campaign was still in its most active phase, Israel conducted an operation in Beirut so audacious and precisely executed that it effectively served as a separate statement to the PLO and its associated organizations, a statement delivered not in the language of covert assassination but in the far more emphatic language of uniformed commandos moving openly through enemy streets in the middle of the night. Operation Spring of Youth took place on the night of April 9th and into the early morning of April 10th, 1973, and it remains one of the most technically accomplished special operations in the history of the Israeli military. The planning was the responsibility of the elite Sayeret Matkal Reconnaissance and Raid Unit, working in close coordination with Mossad's intelligence division and naval commandos from Shayatet 13. The targets were 3 senior PLO leaders who lived and worked in Beirut's Verdun and Rauch neighborhoods, upscale residential districts where the PLO's leadership had established a comfortable presence in the Lebanese capital that had become the organization's primary base of operations after the expulsion from Jordan. The targets were Mohammed Youssef al-Najjar, known as Abu Youssef, who served as the head of PLO intelligence operations and was considered a primary architect of Black September's European activities. Kamal Adwan, responsible for PLO operations in the territories under Israeli administration, and Kamal Nasser, the PLO's official spokesman who also carried a significant organizational and political role. The intelligence picture for the operation had been built over months, with considerable effort directed at identifying precise apartment locations, floor plans, personal security arrangements, and the daily patterns of movement and habit that determined when each target was most vulnerable. This work was conducted through the kind of multiple-sourced intelligence picture that Mossad built by combining human intelligence, informants within the Lebanese civilian and political structure, with technical collection and surveillance work conducted under deep cover in Beirut neighborhoods. By April, the intelligence picture was comprehensive enough that planners could assign specific buildings and specific apartments with confidence. The assault teams crossed the Mediterranean and went ashore on the Lebanese coast from Israeli Navy vessels in rubber boats, landing on a beach south of Beirut in the small hours of April 9th. They were met by Mossad officers who had been operating in Beirut under various commercial and diplomatic covers, and who served as guides through the city's street network to the target locations. The assault groups were dressed in civilian clothes. Some of the men wore wigs, several dressed as women, a detail that became the most memorable element of the operation in subsequent accounts, partly because one of the men wearing a dress and a wig was a future Prime Minister of Israel named Ehud Barak. He was 29 years old at the time and was commanding one of the assault units with the specific, calm focus that later defined his political career, though more uniformly admired in its military expression than in its parliamentary one. The 3 assault teams moved simultaneously to their respective target buildings. The strikes took place within minutes of each other to prevent any sequence of events at one address from alerting targets at another. At Abu Youssef's apartment building, the team reached the door, breached it, and killed him along with a PLO bodyguard and, in the chaos of the entry, Abu Youssef's wife Maha. Her death was not part of the plan and is recorded in subsequent Israeli accounts without celebration, as an acknowledgement of the cost that close-quarters operations in residential buildings can generate even when conducted with professionalism. At Kamal Adwan's building, his security arrangements proved briefly more resistant, and a firefight in the stairwell produced wounded on both sides before the team reached its objective. At Kamal Nasser's apartment, the killing was accomplished with speed and without significant opposition. Simultaneously, a separate Sayeret Matkal team raided the PFLP offices in central Beirut, destroying documents and explosive materials while security teams held the perimeter against Lebanese army and police responses. Another team destroyed a Black September bomb factory in the city. The operation, which lasted approximately 90 minutes from first landing to final departure, produced across its several objectives 3 senior PLO figures killed, significant intelligence and weapons caches destroyed, and an Israeli military force safely extracted without a single fatality on the Israeli side, though several soldiers were wounded. The political and psychological reverberations in Beirut lasted for weeks. Lebanese Prime Minister Saeb Salam resigned over his government's inability to prevent the operation, understanding correctly that an Israeli Special Operations Force moving through the capital's residential streets with apparent impunity was a statement about both Lebanese sovereignty and Lebanese security capability that his government could not survive with its dignity intact. The Palestinian press described the killings in terms of fury and grief. Abu Youssef was mourned as both a political leader and as a man whose wife had died beside him in their home. In Israel, the operation was processed in a different mood entirely. It represented something that the covert killings in European cities, however operationally successful, could not provide: a publicly visible demonstration of reach. Covert assassinations work through their invisibility, Their message is received by the targets and their organizations but cannot be publicly acknowledged or responded to in kind by the Israeli government. Spring of Youth was the opposite. It was an announcement, conducted in the full awareness that it would be attributed immediately and described in newspapers around the world. It said, without ambiguity, that the Israeli state was willing to send uniformed soldiers into the heart of Beirut to kill the people it considered responsible for attacking its citizens, and that no distance and no Lebanese sovereignty would constitute a meaningful deterrent. The operation was commanded in the field by Ehud Barak and overseen at the operational level by Mossad's liaison with military intelligence and Caesarea. It represented a different set of instruments than Harari's covert team, conventional military capability rather than deep cover assassination methodology, but it was animated by precisely the same political authorization that Golda Meir had granted the previous autumn. The two programs, the covert civilian-style killings in European cities and the uniformed military raid in Beirut, were not parallel operations managed by rival bureaucracies. They were coordinated elements of a single coherent response to Munich, deployed in different contexts against different categories of target. What Spring of Youth could not accomplish, however, was what the covert program was specifically designed to achieve: the systematic elimination of individuals who were difficult to reach militarily because they lived among civilian populations in European cities and moved through the world as ordinary residents with professional covers and no visible security profile. The most important such individual, the operational architect of Munich, the man whose intelligence fingerprints were on the entire Black September European structure, had not yet been touched. He was still out there, moving between Beirut and Western Europe, growing more careful with each passing month, learning from the losses his organization had sustained. His name, and the story of the decade-long hunt that would eventually reach him, was the thread that ran beneath every other element of this operation. But in the summer of 1973, before that hunt could resume with full intensity, something was going to happen in a small Norwegian town that would stop everything cold, create a crisis in the Norwegian courts, and leave a permanent mark on the history of the organization that had, until that moment, moved through European capitals without generating the kind of visible catastrophe that changes everything. Lillehammer is a Norwegian town of modest size in the Uppland region, roughly 2 hours north of Oslo by road, built along the western shore of Lake Mjosa in a landscape that moves between pastoral and genuinely dramatic depending on the season. In July of 1973, it was a pleasant tourist destination in its summer character, drawing visitors to the lake and the surrounding countryside. It had a cinema, several cafes and restaurants, a modest main street, the ordinary social infrastructure of a prosperous Norwegian town. It was not the kind of place where anything unusual happened. It was also, as of midsummer 1973, the location where a Mossad surveillance team had arrived on the basis of intelligence reports describing the presence of Ali Hassan Salameh. The intelligence that sent the team to Lillehammer came from a combination of sources whose precise reliability was not fully verified before the operation was launched. What the team received was a description: a man fitting certain physical characteristics, traveling under alias, believed by the intelligence network to be Salameh, and a location: Norway. The intelligence was fragmentary enough that it required on-the-ground confirmation before any action could be taken, and a surveillance team was dispatched precisely to conduct that confirmation, to establish visual identity of the subject, and to report back to Harari before an operational decision was made. The surveillance team arrived in Lillehammer and within days identified their subject. A man observed at a local swimming pool, at a cinema, and on the town's main streets, whose physical characteristics were judged by the surveillance operatives to correspond sufficiently to the description they had been given. He was of North African appearance, approximately the right age, present in an unusual location without an obvious explanation, and his patterns of movement, the small, habitual observations that trained surveillance officers accumulate and weigh, read to the people watching as the behavior of someone from a different operational context. The surveillance team communicated back to Harari. The assessment they sent was one of high confidence. The man they were watching was, they believed, Ali Hassan Salameh. He was not. The man they had identified was Ahmad Bouchiki, a 35-year-old Moroccan waiter who had come to Norway years earlier, settled in Lillehammer, found work in the local food service industry, and built an ordinary life in a country that had treated him with the Norwegian combination of reserve and genuine fairness. His Norwegian wife, Toril, was pregnant with their first child. They had been to the cinema that evening, a detail that was unexceptional in every way except that Mossad surveillance operatives had been watching Buchiki as he left the cinema and were following him through the streets of Lillehammer in the final minutes before they killed him. The decision to proceed was made on the basis of the surveillance team's identification. Whatever verification process was supposed to occur before an irreversible action was taken, it either did not function correctly in this case or was judged to have been sufficiently completed by the confidence of the operatives conducting it. At around 10:30 in the evening of July 21, 1973, on a street near the bus station in Lillehammer, two men approached Buchiki and shot him multiple times at close range. Toril, visibly pregnant, was with him. She witnessed the shooting and was left standing in the street over her husband's body as the men ran. She was screaming for help within seconds. The street was not empty. A nearby bus and its passengers were witnesses to what had just happened. Several Lillehammer residents heard the shots and the screaming and came to their windows. Norwegian police were contacted and responded quickly, because Norway was a country where gunshots in a residential area constituted an extraordinary event, and the response infrastructure mobilized with the urgency appropriate to something its operators had never encountered before. The operational failure that followed the shooting deepened the original catastrophe through a series of compounding errors. Some members of the team had left Lillehammer by car through prearranged routes, but others had not completed their exit in time. Norwegian police, working from witness descriptions and a response speed that the team had not adequately factored into their exit planning, intercepted several of the operatives within hours. At a bus stop, in a parking area, and near a rental car return, individual team members were detained by Norwegian police who had deployed quickly and comprehensively in a way that the operations planners had not anticipated from a country without experience of terrorism or espionage-related violence. The arrests over the following 12 hours ultimately netted 6 individuals connected to the operation. Some were identified relatively quickly as Israeli intelligence operatives through documentation inconsistencies and the intelligence analysis of the Norwegian Security Service, which was thorough and methodical even if it was working in unfamiliar territory. The 6 included Abraham Gemmer, a senior Mossad officer who had been present in an operational capacity, and Sylvia Raphael, a South African-born Israeli officer who had been serving as a field operative in the surveillance and coordination element of the team. Others arrested included Marianne Gladnikoff, a Swedish national of Jewish descent who had been used as an auxiliary in the operation, and several other individuals in various supporting roles. They were held in Norwegian custody. The Israeli government adopted its standard position. No official acknowledgement of any intelligence operation, no confirmation of the identities of those arrested, no public statement. Norwegian authorities proceeded on the basis of what they had. Dead man, 6 people in custody, evidence of coordinated surveillance, and a killing conducted with professional methodology. The thing that made Lillehammer categorically different from everything that had preceded it was not simply that the operation had failed, or that people had been arrested. Both of those things had happened in other intelligence operations and had been managed. What made it different was that the man who had been killed was innocent. He had no connection to any intelligence service, any terrorist organization, or any political activity of any kind. He was a waiter who had been to the cinema with his pregnant wife. The wrong identification had resulted in the killing of an utterly uninvolved person, and that person's widow was alive and talking to Norwegian police and Norwegian journalists and describing what she had seen. The contrast with the operation's intended purpose, accountability for men responsible for the murder of 11 Israeli athletes, was of a kind that no organizational justification could bridge. The Munich massacre had been the moral foundation on which everything else was built. Lillehammer was its precise inversion. The innocent dying for the guilty, the wrong life taken, the widow left on a street in a Norwegian town over a body that had no frame of reference for what had just been done to it. It was a catastrophe of the highest order, and the people who had authorized the operation understood that without being told. The arrests would become a trial. The trial would become a conviction, and the conviction would begin a period of intensive, painful self-examination within Mossad about how an organization that prided itself on operational precision had made a mistake of this magnitude, and what it intended to do about every implication of having made it. Toril Buchiki's face, her testimony, the image of a pregnant woman on a Norwegian street over a body that should never have been there, these things circulated through the organization's internal culture in a way that intelligence failures of a purely technical nature never do. Some failures are absorbed and corrected. This one had to be carried. The trial of the Lillehammer defendants opened in Oslo in January of 1974, approximately 6 months after Ahmad Buchiki was killed, and it proceeded with the methodical seriousness of the Norwegian criminal justice system working through a set of facts it had never encountered before and was, with considerable institutional dignity, determined to handle correctly. The Norwegian public prosecutor had a case that was factually clear. A man had been shot dead on a public street. 6 people had been arrested in connection with the killing, and the evidence assembled by the Norwegian Security Service pointed unambiguously toward a coordinated intelligence operation conducted by agents of the Israeli government. What made the prosecution proceeding complicated was not the facts themselves but the political architecture surrounding them, which had no precedent in Norwegian legal history and no obvious template for resolution. Abraham Gemmer and Sylvia Raphael were the most senior Israeli intelligence officers among those arrested, and the ones whose operational roles in the killing were most directly evidenced by what Norwegian investigators had developed. Gemmer, 40 years old, had been working as one of the team's coordination officers. Raphael, 32, was a Mossad field operative who had been involved in the surveillance work prior to the killing and was present in Lillehammer during the operation. She was South African-born, the daughter of Israeli parents, and had been recruited into Mossad in the 1960s. Her presence as a female intelligence officer in an active operational role was itself notable for the period, though the Norwegian court was not especially interested in its notable quality, being primarily focused on her legal responsibility for an activity that had resulted in the death of an innocent man. The defense arguments were limited by the facts. The defendants could not claim that Buchiki had been a legitimate target. He clearly had not been, or that the operation they had been involved in was lawful under Norwegian law because it clearly was not. What they could do was argue degrees of responsibility, that some of those arrested had operational roles more peripheral to the killing itself, and that conviction on the most serious charges required evidence of intention and knowledge that not all of the defendants possessed. These arguments were heard and partially accepted. Gemmer and Raphael were convicted on charges of complicity in voluntary manslaughter, a distinction from murder that acknowledged the absence of premeditated intent to kill an innocent man while maintaining criminal responsibility for participating in an operation that did precisely that. They received sentences of 5.5 years imprisonment. The other defendants received lighter sentences reflecting their more peripheral roles. Marian Gladnikoff, whose involvement in the operation had been primarily logistical, received a shorter sentence. 2 of those arrested were acquitted. The sentencing was covered extensively across European and North American press. Israeli journalists reported on it with the particular difficulty of people describing a serious failure by an organization that their country depended on, in a register that mixed acknowledgement of the failure with the political sensitivity of what full public discussion might damage. The Israeli government issued no official statement about the trial or its results. Officially, Israel maintained its position that it had no knowledge of any such operation and no connection to those convicted in Norway. Officially and privately, however, the Lillehammer affair had produced within Mossad and within the government that authorized the operation a reckoning of substantial depth. The reputational damage was not primarily about the conviction. No intelligence service expects its operations to be judged in foreign courts on the basis of international law niceties it has already decided not to observe. The damage was about the wrong man. The surveillance failure that had resulted in Buchiki's identification as Salome represented an analytical breakdown that could not be explained away as bad luck or operational friction. How had an experienced team, operating under a mandate requiring confirmation of target identity before lethal action, proceeded to kill a Moroccan waiter? The internal inquiry produced answers that were uncomfortable. pressure to produce results after Mohammed Boudia's elimination and the perceived operational gap that followed. Intelligence that had been assessed as more certain than its sourcing actually supported. A team dynamic in the field that may have moved to confirm what the intelligence suggested rather than challenge it, and a communication process with headquarters that did not adequately preserve the ability to stop operations when identification uncertainty remained. Mossad Director Zvi Zamir, who had overseen the program from its inception, faced the internal consequences of Lilyhammer with the seriousness it demanded. The first phase of the operation was effectively frozen. Surviving team members who had not been arrested were given time and distance to ensure their security was not further compromised. The financial and administrative infrastructure was reviewed and adjusted. The intelligence gathering and verification procedures were revised with the explicit goal of preventing another identification failure, and those revisions constituted an internal acknowledgement that the procedures had failed. Mike Harari remained in his role through and after the Lilyhammer period. Though the shape of the program's operations changed, the pace slackened. The team's activity in Western Europe reduced significantly. This reflected both the operational disruption of having 6 members arrested and the calculated necessity of allowing the Norwegian investigation and trial to proceed and conclude before resuming activity that risked additional exposure. The Norwegian Security Service had demonstrated, by the quality of its response and investigation, that operating in Scandinavia carried real risks that earlier operations in Rome, Paris, and Cyprus had not generated. The lesson was absorbed. Gemmer and Raphael did not serve their full sentences. Both were released in 1975 under circumstances that involved diplomatic negotiations between Israel and Norway, including compensation paid to Toriel Bachiki and her son, Abraham, born after his father's death. The compensation, financial acknowledgement by Israel to the surviving family of a man killed in a mistake, constituted the closest thing to official acknowledgement of responsibility that the Lilyhammer operation ever generated from the Israeli side. Israel did not admit publicly that its operatives had carried out the killing or that the men convicted in Oslo were Israeli intelligence officers. But the compensation payment, made through back channels and eventually reported in press accounts, spoke with its own clarity. Toriel Bachiki spent years after her husband's death in the double difficulty of a grief that had a specific and identified cause about which the world's most relevant party would say nothing publicly. She had been a witness to the killing. She had provided testimony at the trial. She had been compensated. She had received, in formal legal terms, more accountability than most families of intelligence operation victims ever see. And she had not received an acknowledgement. The absence of that acknowledgement, something as simple as the Israeli government confirming publicly that its agents had shot her husband by mistake, remained a wound that formal legal and financial process could not close. She continued speaking about it for decades. The operation's resumption after the Lilyhammer pause was slower and more careful. The men on the list who remained alive in 1974 and 1975 were still on the list. The organization had not abandoned the mandate Golda Meir had signed in the autumn of 1972, but it had absorbed a lesson about the relationship between operational pressure and analytical discipline that shaped everything that followed. The primary target, the one whose name had been attached to the false intelligence that sent the team to Norway, was still alive and operating. He was still the most important name on the list. He was also, by now, more protected and more cautious than he had ever been. Hunting him would take years more. To understand why Ali Hassan Salameh mattered, why his name sat at the center of Mossad's target list for the better part of a decade, why the organization spent years and considerable resources and eventually the most sophisticated infiltration operation it had yet attempted in order to reach him, requires understanding both who he was and what he represented in the specific political and operational landscape of Palestinian militant activity in the 1970s. He was born around 1940 in the village of Kulla in the Lydda district, in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. His father was Ali Hassan Salameh, the elder, a Palestinian military commander of significant reputation who led forces in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War and was killed that year at the Battle of Ras Al Ain. The father's death and the loss of the village of Kula to Israeli forces in the fighting that followed the declaration of Israeli statehood gave the son a biographical frame from the first years of consciousness. A family with a particular standing in Palestinian political memory, a homeland that was gone, and a father who had died fighting for it before the child was old enough to carry the fact consciously. The younger Salome grew up in Gaza under Egyptian administration, then in Lebanon, then moved between Egypt and Germany for his education. He studied engineering in both countries, and the years in Germany were particularly important for what they developed in him. He came back from Europe speaking German, speaking English, having acquired the ease in Western urban environments that Palestinian political operatives in the 1960s often lacked. He was charming in a way that was not performance but personality, open and direct and warm, with the specific social fluency of someone who had grown up navigating multiple cultures and had found that people responded to him in all of them. He was physically striking, dark, tall, with the kind of looks that made him memorable in rooms, and he dressed with an attention to style that was unusual in the context of diaspora Palestinian political life. He had been in his early 20s when he was recruited into Fatah, the Palestinian political and militant organization that would eventually form the dominant faction within the PLO. His connection was through Yasser Arafat, whom he had met through political networks in Egypt, and the relationship between them took on a quality of particular patronage over the years, Arafat treating Salome with the combination of trust and investment that leaders sometimes extend to men who remind them of possibilities they themselves once represented. Salome became, over the course of the late 1960s and early 1970s, the closest thing to a right-hand man that Arafat possessed in the operational rather than the political sphere. His specific role in the founding and direction of Black September has been documented through various sources including intelligence files, journalistic investigations, and the subsequent accounts of PLO members who spent those years inside the organization. He was not the organization's political founder. That credit belongs primarily to Salah Khalif, who went by the name Abu Iyad. But Black September's operational capability, the network of European contacts, the logistics infrastructure, the communication systems, and the relationship management with sympathetic organizations on the European radical left, was built to a significant degree by Salome. The Munich operation in particular bears his organizational signature. An operation designed for maximum international visibility, conducted in an environment where the perpetrators could be reasonably confident of escape, with a level of planning detail that reflected access to real intelligence about the target environment. What made him particularly difficult to pursue after Munich was not simply that he had not been present at the attack, though that physical distance from the crime complicated the intelligence case in some respects. It was that he was functioning simultaneously in multiple capacities that created conflicting interests around his elimination. He was by the mid-1970s the head of Force 17, the PLO's personal protection unit responsible for the physical security of Arafat and senior PLO leadership. This gave him operational control over the armed personnel guarding the most important figures in the Palestinian political movement, which meant that his organization had strong practical incentives to protect him regardless of the political and diplomatic pressures that might otherwise have made protecting him awkward. He was also, and this is a fact documented through multiple independent sources including journalist Kai Bird's biography of CIA officer Robert Ames, in a working relationship with the United States Central Intelligence Agency. The specific nature of this relationship is important. It was not a fully recruited agent relationship in which Salome provided intelligence to the CIA in exchange for direction and resource. It was a more ambiguous liaison, maintained through a CIA officer in Beirut named Robert Ames, who understood the value of maintaining access to a senior figure in the PLO security apparatus in the context of the increasingly complicated Lebanese political environment of the mid-1970s. Ames, a gifted Arabic speaker and one of the CIA's most skilled relationship builders in the Arab world, had cultivated the connection with Salome as a channel through which messages could be passed, interests could be communicated, and the two parties could maintain at least a degree of mutual awareness during a period of intense regional volatility. The specific value to the CIA was straightforward. Salome was close to Arafat, commanded the PLO security forces, had connections across the Palestinian political spectrum, and could, if properly handled, be a source of early warning about developments that mattered to American interests in Lebanon and across the region. PLO-American relations in this period were formally non-existent. The United States had given commitments to Israel not to open official dialogue with the PLO, but informally, through exactly this kind of connective tissue, the two parties maintained a working awareness of each other that formal policy prohibited. This CIA relationship created a complication for Mossad that was real and ongoing. The CIA communicated to Israeli intelligence, through channels that were not always explicit but were sufficiently clear, that Salameh represented an asset whose value they would prefer to see preserved. The language was diplomatic and deniable. American intelligence services do not formally advise Allied intelligence services which targets not to kill, but the message was received. Mossad understood that eliminating Salameh would cost it something in the relationship with the Americans, at a time when that relationship was strategically vital to Israeli interests in ways that went far beyond any single operation. This did not remove Salameh from the list, but it added a weight to the calculus around him that other targets had not carried. He was also, by the mid-1970s, aware that he was being hunted. The losses that Black September had sustained in Western Europe and the precision with which targets had been selected told any technically sophisticated analyst that an intelligence service with a detailed organizational picture was working through a prioritized list. His name was at the top of any reasonable version of such a list, and he knew it. His security arrangements reflected that knowledge. Rotating residences in Beirut, multiple vehicles, armed escort, reduced travel to Western Europe, an operational security consciousness that had been calibrated upward with each passing year. He had also, in the mid-1970s, married Georgina Rizik, the Lebanese model who had won the Miss Universe title in 1971. The marriage gave Salameh a domestic and social presence in Beirut's upper-class circles that was visible and well documented in Lebanese society press. Photographs of the couple at social events, the Red Prince and his beauty queen, as the Lebanese papers called them. He was not hiding his identity. He was living in the city that was his operational base, surrounded by people he trusted, in security arrangements he considered adequate, with enough enemies to have long since calibrated his personal risk tolerance to a level that allowed him to function. He was wrong about adequate. The years between Lilyhammer and the final operation against Salameh represent the part of this story that is most difficult to reconstruct precisely, because they consist primarily of the patient, invisible work of intelligence, the accumulation of information in fragments, the analysis of patterns, the development and loss of sources, the long professional attention of an organization maintaining a target on its list through years of operational constraint. It is in the nature of this kind of work that its successes leave fewer records than its failures, and in this period there were both. The immediate aftermath of Lilyhammer had produced a necessary operational pause. 6 operatives arrested, 2 convicted and imprisoned, the intelligence community of a close Western ally now privately certain that Israeli agents had killed a man on Norwegian soil. The organizational and diplomatic damage that managing this required was considerable, and the careful tempo at which it was managed, not panicked, not dismissive, but deliberate, reflected the specific quality of the people running the organization. Mossad did not collapse under Lilyhammer. It absorbed the impact, revised its procedures, and continued. What the revisions produced was a program that moved more carefully and verified more thoroughly before acting. The identification failure that had killed Bachiki was dissected in detail in Mossad's internal review, and the specific procedural vulnerabilities it had exposed were addressed through new requirements. Multiple independent confirmations of target identity before authorization for lethal action, stricter separation between intelligence analysts assessing a target and operational personnel planning a strike against it, clearer escalation paths when field assessment and intelligence assessment diverged. These were institutional changes that cost time and added friction to the process. They were also, as subsequent events would demonstrate, insufficient to completely prevent future errors of judgment, but they raised the bar considerably. The resumption of targeted operations after the Lilyhammer period was gradual. Throughout 1974 and into 1975, intelligence work on the remaining targets continued while overt operational activity was reduced. Several individuals who had been on earlier versions of the working list were assessed as having moved to positions or locations that made near-term operation infeasible. Some names were effectively deferred. Salome remained perpetually active on the list, perpetually the highest priority, perpetually the most serious challenge. By 1974, Lebanon had moved into the complex, violent spiral that would eventually become the full civil war of 1975 to 1990. The PLO's presence in Lebanon, already substantial after the 1970 expulsion from Jordan, had grown to the point where Arafat's organization effectively controlled significant territory in the south of the country and functioned as a state within a state in the southern Beirut suburbs. Salome, as head of Force 17, was a constant operational presence in this environment, attending PLO security meetings, coordinating the bodyguard arrangements for senior leadership, moving through the specific geography of PLO-controlled Beirut that was, in theory, off-limits to operatives of any foreign intelligence service without explicit permission. An attempt to track Salome that came close to an operational strike occurred in the mid-1970s in an instance that has been reported in various intelligence histories without full confirmation of its details. The accounts describe a Mossad surveillance operation in Beirut that established Salome's movements sufficiently to authorize an action, only to have the operation aborted at a late stage because of either intelligence uncertainty about the target's exact location or communication from a third party. The CIA's Beirut station, according to some accounts, that conveyed sufficient concern about the timing to cause the operational command to stand down. The specific details of this account have never been confirmed by either party and may represent a composite of incomplete information. What is clearly true is that several years after Lilyhammer, Salome remained alive, and whatever opportunities had existed to change that had not been taken. The intelligence picture that Mossad maintained on Salome through the mid and late 1970s was built from multiple streams. Human intelligence from within Lebanon, from PLO contacts willing to provide information about internal movements, from the various Israeli intelligence assets maintained in Beirut under business and diplomatic covers before the civil war made that environment increasingly difficult to operate in. Signals intelligence that tracked communication patterns and occasional operational details. And analytical work that combined these inputs with open-source monitoring of Salome's public activities. He was not invisible in Lebanon, appearing at social occasions, attending PLO events, living a life in Beirut that was not entirely hidden. From this intelligence work, an operational picture of his movements was gradually assembled. His residential patterns showed some variation but certain constants. He had a preferred route between his apartment in the Rauch district and several locations he frequented regularly in the Rue Verdun area of Beirut, a street of mid-century apartment buildings and office structures several kilometers south of the city's commercial center. His security detail, Force 17 personnel, traveled with him in a convoy configuration that was professional in intent but constrained by the realities of Beirut's congested streets. A convoy is an effective security measure on open roads and a much more complicated one in an urban traffic environment where its movement can be predicted and observed. The key intelligence insight that would eventually make the operation against him possible was not about his location on any given day but about the patterns that defined his movement across days and weeks. Somewhere in this accumulated picture, a vulnerability appeared. A part of his routine consistent enough, a stretch of road familiar enough, a window of opportunity reliable enough. Creating the capability to exploit it required something different from anything the campaign had used before. Not a team arriving in a city for weeks of surveillance and a quick operation, but a presence embedded in Beirut over months, functioning as a genuine resident with a genuine cover, watching and waiting and reporting with the patience that only deep cover allows. The organization began identifying who could do this, and then began building the cover for them. It required a specific kind of person. Not a professional intelligence officer whose training might produce the particular edge that experienced security personnel could detect, but someone whose natural character could sustain a deep cover across multiple months in a conflict-torn city, whose presence in Beirut could be explained and maintained without the accumulated stress of long-term deception becoming visible in ways that compromised the operation. The person they identified was a woman. Her name, as it eventually became known, was Erica Chambers. She was British-born. She had the kind of biographical background that made a cover as a Western aid organization employee not just plausible but authentic enough to survive the social scrutiny of Beirut's tight-knit expatriate community. She spoke good enough French for the city's linguistic context. And she had the quality that the operation required above all others: the capacity to be genuinely present over a long period without the specific performance anxiety that tends to accumulate in people conducting extended deception. The operation she was going to be part of would take more than a year to develop. When it concluded, Ali Hassan Salameh would finally be off the list. The city of Beirut, Salameh's base of operations, his home, the place where he had lived under the assumption that PLO authority and his own security arrangements made him unreachable, would turn out to be the place where the longest, most complicated element of the hunt was quietly, patiently, and irrevocably completed. Not by a team arriving with guns, but by a woman with a humanitarian cover, a rented apartment, and the patience to wait. Beirut in 1977 was a city in its third year of civil war, and the specific quality of that condition, not the abstract fact of conflict but its daily texture, shaped everything about what Erica Chambers had to navigate when she arrived in the Lebanese capital in the second half of the year. The city had divided itself along political and sectarian lines into a patchwork of militia-controlled territories where the effective authority changed block by block in certain neighborhoods, where the sound of distant gunfire had become as much a part of the urban ambient as traffic noise, and where the enormous humanitarian displacement created by the fighting had called into existence a substantial international aid and relief presence that provided, for someone with the right background and preparation, a natural and credible reason to be there. The official story that Erica Chambers carried for her life in Beirut was that she worked for a children's welfare organization, a humanitarian cover that placed her squarely within the expatriate aid community that occupied a specific niche in Beirut social life. People whose presence was accepted, whose work was genuine enough to be visible, and who moved through multiple areas of the city for legitimate reasons related to their professional responsibilities. The cover had been built with the kind of depth that comes from actually knowing the relevant organizational landscape, the names and structures and current concerns of the real organizations operating in Lebanon, the specific vocabulary and professional culture of international development and relief work. She was good at it. This point matters for reasons beyond professional tribute. The specific challenge of deep cover in a city like Beirut in 1977 was not primarily about the mechanics of false documentation or concealing a professional affiliation. It was about the social and emotional demands of being authentically present over months, building relationships, developing routines, becoming a known and trusted figure in a community that had its own layers of careful observation. Beirut's expatriate community was not naive about the intelligence dimensions of foreign presence in the city. The Civil War had produced an environment thick with competing intelligence services, foreign agents, armed faction representatives, and journalists who had spent years developing sources across every sector of Lebanese political life. Being simply present in Beirut for an extended period while maintaining a cover required a quality of genuine human engagement that no amount of technical training could substitute for. She worked. She was seen at the relevant organizational offices. She attended the social gatherings of the expatriate community. She built the specific texture of a life in the city, favorite restaurants, market routes, colleagues, acquaintances, the particular social geography that a person develops in any place they live for an extended period. And during this period, she was watching, not primarily in the way of a surveillance specialist maintaining concentrated active observation, but in the quieter, more diffuse way of someone whose everyday movements through a neighborhood provide an ongoing accumulation of information about patterns, rhythms, the specific predictabilities of a particular place at particular times. The neighborhood that mattered was the area around Rue Verdun, a long street in the Hammer district of West Beirut where a substantial number of PLO-connected officials, including several figures in Salameh's immediate professional circle, lived and worked. The PLO's extensive presence in West Beirut in the mid to late 1970s meant that senior officials moved through the neighborhood with more freedom than operational security would have recommended, because the Lebanese Civil War had effectively given the PLO authority over much of West Beirut's security environment. Salameh's apartment was in a building on this street. His route patterns within the Verdun area were, over the months of observation, well enough mapped to allow the construction of a reliable picture of when and where he moved. The specific intelligence challenge was identifying the regular pattern within Salameh's movement that offered a reliable enough window for a remotely triggered device. Shooting Salome directly was not realistically available as an option given the Force 17 protective detail that accompanied him. The detail was sufficient in number and training to make a close-quarters attack by a small team extremely unlikely to succeed without casualties that would compromise the entire operation. The vehicle convoy was similarly protected in ways that made an ambush on open ground difficult to execute cleanly. What was potentially available was a device that could be prepositioned and triggered at a moment when the operational conditions were right. Specifically, a car bomb loaded with enough explosive charge to neutralize the vehicles in the convoy rather than a single vehicle. The preparation for the device itself was the work of specialists who were not part of the Beirut resident network. They came in, as such personnel typically move in covert programs, from outside the established cover environment, met with the on-the-ground intelligence chain, and worked on the operational elements that required their specific expertise. The selection of the vehicle, the acquisition and placement of the explosive charge, the triggering mechanism, and the detonation approach were all developed for the specific operational context. A busy urban street, a target moving in a convoy, potential for civilian casualties that needed to be minimized through precise timing. The car chosen was a Volkswagen, an unremarkable white sedan that was parked on Rue Verdun in a position consistent with where Salome's convoy passed regularly. The explosive charge inside it was calibrated, as carefully as such calculations can be in an event where the primary variable is the precise position of moving vehicles at the moment of detonation, to direct its force toward the convoy vehicles. The triggering was to be by remote signal, which required someone in observation position at the moment of detonation who could verify the target's presence in the convoy before sending the signal. What the months-long observation had established with sufficient confidence to support the committee's authorization was a specific stretch of Rue Verdun, a specific part of Salome's regular movement pattern, and a specific temporal window within which the convoy would reliably pass. The intelligence picture going into January of 1979 supported a level of confidence that the operation had been authorized. By the third week of January, the operational elements were in place. The vehicle was in position. The personnel needed for the final step were ready. Erica Chambers' specific role in the final phase has been described in various accounts without full confirmation of all its details. What is established is that she was present in Beirut through the operation and departed the city after it was complete. Whether she was the individual who sent the detonation signal or whether that function was performed by someone else on the operational team has not been publicly confirmed. What is clear is that the decision to proceed, the final authorization that converted months of preparation into an irreversible act, was made on a Tuesday morning in January 1979 when Ali Hassan Salome's convoy turned onto Rue Verdun. Whatever the precise mechanics of the final moments, they were the end product of more than a year of patient, disciplined, invisible work conducted in a city at war by a person who had built a false life sufficient to sustain genuine observation without being seen for what she actually was. The gap between what Erica Chambers appeared to be and what she was doing is the specific space in which covert intelligence work lives. A space that demands an unusual kind of human being and exacts a cost from that kind of person that no debrief or organizational commendation can fully address. She had come to Beirut to help find a man who had helped plan the killing of 11 athletes. She had found him. Now the people responsible for what came next were ready to act. January 22, 1979, was a Tuesday. The morning in Beirut was clear and cold, the kind of winter day that reminds you the city sits on the Mediterranean coast only when the wind moves through the street in a certain way from the sea. The Lebanese capital's civil war was in its fourth year, and the specific quality of the city in this period was the particular urban rhythm that prolonged conflict produces in places experienced enough in it. A population moving through its daily patterns with calibrated awareness of which areas carried what level of risk on a given day. The sound of gunfire absorbed as ambient information rather than emergency, the specific visual vocabulary of militia checkpoints and sandbag buildings, having become the unremarkable furniture of everyday streets. Ali Hassan Salome left his apartment building in the Rouch district of West Beirut that morning in the fashion that had characterized his movements for years. In a convoy with Force 17 bodyguards in the vehicles around him, moving through streets that his security detail had evaluated for obvious threat. He was 37 years old. He had been living with the knowledge that Mossad wanted him dead for several years, had seen the men around him in the Black September network eliminated one by one, had watched the hunt accelerate and then pause after Lilyhammer and then resume in the quieter, more careful form that made it harder to detect and worse in some ways to anticipate. He had survived. He had taken precautions. He had a wife and young sons and a social life visible enough in Beirut papers that he was something of a local celebrity. The operational commander who had survived Mossad's best efforts and kept living his life in their general direction. The convoy moved toward Rue Verdun. The white Volkswagen was parked near the intersection of Rue Verdun and a connecting street, its explosive charge arranged inside with the care that distinguishes professional work from improvised device-making. The charge had been calibrated and positioned by people who understood what was required to produce a sufficient blast radius to affect a moving convoy on a narrow city street, while the detonation timing was managed by whoever was in observation position. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Salameh's convoy passed the position of the Volkswagen on Rue Verdun. The device detonated. The explosion generated a fireball and a shock wave that destroyed the Land Rover in which Salameh was traveling and damaged the vehicles immediately before and behind it in the convoy. 4 of Salameh's bodyguards were killed in the blast. 3 bystanders died from the explosion and the secondary effects of the burning vehicles. Salameh sustained catastrophic wounds from the blast. He was taken to the American University Hospital in Beirut, where he died of his injuries some hours later. He was 37 years old. He had been the most important name on the list since the list was first drawn up in the autumn of 1972. He had been its most difficult and most protected target. He had been the man whose name had been incorrectly attached to the intelligence that sent a team to Norway in July 1973 and resulted in the worst recognized failure of the entire operation. It had taken 6.5 years from Munich to reach him. The PLO's response was immediate and public. A statement of mourning for their slain commander, a declaration of the nobility of his service, the full ceremonial weight of an organization that understood how to use its grief politically and exercised that understanding in every formal expression it could arrange. Arrangements were made to move his body to Lebanon's Martyrs' Cemetery for burial. Yasser Arafat, whose relationship with Salameh had been that of patron and protege across more than a decade, was reported to be devastated by the killing in the particular way that the deaths of people who are both strategically invaluable and personally important constitute a double loss. Robert Ames, the CIA Beirut station officer whose liaison relationship with Salameh had been one of the more consequential and ambiguous intelligence connections of the period, was reported to have reacted to the killing with genuine distress. He had lost a contact whose value to the CIA's operational picture in Lebanon and the broader Palestinian political environment had been substantial, and he had lost it to the Allied intelligence service whose interests in eliminating Salameh were, to his professional mind, understandable and irreconcilable with his own organization's interests in maintaining the connection. Robert Ames himself would be killed 4 years later in the 1983 bombing of the United States Embassy in Beirut, one of 63 people who died in that attack. The intersection of his story with Salameh's reflects the specific historical tragedy of a period in which American and Israeli intelligence interests in Lebanon pointed in genuinely opposing directions, and the cost of that divergence was human. The Salameh killing did not end the operation. Several names from the original list remained, men who had played supporting or organizational roles in Munich or in Black September's broader European infrastructure, and who had survived the first decade of the program through geography, changed circumstances, or simple luck. Among them was Mohammed Daoud Odeh, known as Abu Daoud, who was a founding figure of Black September and arguably the PLO official with the deepest institutional involvement in the Munich planning. He survived an assassination attempt in Warsaw in 1981, taking multiple gunshot wounds but recovering. The attack was widely attributed to the same program, though never officially confirmed. Abu Daoud lived until 2010, dying of kidney failure in a Damascus hospital at the age of 73, the most senior surviving figure from the Munich planning structure, who outlasted both the operation aimed at him and most of the people who had authorized it. The connection was finally closed, in a manner of speaking, in Paris on June 8, 1992, when Atef Psizo was shot twice in the head outside a Paris hotel. Psizo had been a senior PLO intelligence figure, and is identified in multiple accounts as having held a significant operational role related to Black September's European activities, including Munich. His killing took place nearly 20 years after the massacre he had helped plan. Israeli authorities never officially acknowledged it. But the method, 2 precise rounds in a public space, no claim of responsibility, a clean departure, carried the unmistakable signature of a program that had, by 1992, been operating longer than many of the men it was pursuing had been functioning at the time of the crime. The 2-decade arc of the campaign had by then accumulated a body count and a geographical footprint that spanned Rome, Paris, Geneva, Nicosia, Beirut, Warsaw, and Oslo. It had produced diplomatic crises, criminal convictions, a high-profile intelligence failure that became a byword for the specific danger of intelligence pressure overriding analytical discipline, and a body of operational doctrine that governments around the world read carefully whether they admitted it or not. It had also, by the early 1990s, produced the particular exhaustion that sustained covert programs eventually generate in the people who carry them, not the exhaustion of failure but the different, quieter kind that comes from years of living in the specific moral and operational climate of a program that justifies itself in terms of justice and delivers it, when it delivers it at all, through methods that no ordinary language of justice can straightforwardly describe. The operation had done most of what it set out to do. Whether what it had done was enough, whether it was right, and what it had cost beyond the dollar values in Swiss bank accounts and the names on both sides of the operations ledger. These were questions that did not end when the last name was crossed from the list. The story of Operation Wrath of God does not end with a single definitive moment. No handshake, no signed document, no public declaration that the account was settled and the program concluded. Instead, it ends the way most covert programs end. Gradually, through the accumulation of completions and deferrals and changed circumstances, until the active phase simply ceases producing targets and the machinery that was built to pursue them quietly stands down. What remains afterward is the question of what it all meant, a question that does not resolve more cleanly in hindsight than it did for the people living inside it. The immediate legacy of the operation was a series of organizational facts. Over approximately 2 decades, the program killed between 12 and 16 individuals. The precise number depends on which operations are attributed to the program and how its boundaries are defined, who were connected in varying degrees to Black September's European activities and the Munich massacre. The primary target of the operation, Ali Hassan Salameh, was eliminated 6.5 years after Munich. The individuals identified by Israeli intelligence as the most significant operational figures in the Munich planning were for the most part reached, tried by the standard that this program operated under, and removed. Several significant figures survived, including Abu Daoud, and at least one, Abu Iyad, the political founder of Black September, was killed in 1991 by a Palestinian faction rather than by Israel. The Munich attacks principal authorizing figures within the PLO's political leadership were never directly targeted since Mossad drew a distinction between the political decision-makers at the level of Arafat and the operational implementers whose direct involvement could be specifically connected to Munich. The doctrine that the operation established targeted killing of specific individuals identified as responsible for terrorist activity against Israeli citizens, conducted covertly in foreign jurisdictions without those governments' permission, has shaped Israeli intelligence and military practice from 1972 to the present. The specific procedures refined through Wrath of God, the committee authorization structure, the requirement for target verification at multiple levels, the financial and administrative infrastructure for deniable operations, the use of deep cover operatives for extended preparatory work, all of these became templates that subsequent Israeli operations adapted and extended. The assassination of Hezbollah military commander Ahmad Mughniya in Damascus in 2008, the killing of Hamas military chief Ahmed Jabari in Gaza in 2012, the long campaign against Iranian nuclear scientists in the 2010s, these and others share the operational DNA of what was built in response to Munich. Other governments observed and drew their own conclusions. The targeted killing programs that the United States developed and expanded significantly after 2001 operate within a moral and legal framework that was in part influenced by how Israeli authorities had justified, implemented, and publicly debated the predecessor operations. The international law dimension never resolved into consensus. The argument that targeted killing of individuals directly responsible for terrorist acts constitutes a form of lawful self-defense has proponents in international law scholarship and among governments that have found it operationally useful, and it has opponents who argue that it creates no workable limiting principle and represents the adoption of assassination as a normalized instrument of state power. Both sides of this argument can point to consequences and precedents that support their position, and neither has succeeded in definitively winning the debate in any body of international law. What Wrath of God contributed to that debate was a concrete case study of how a democratic government with a functioning legal system and a genuine security threat chose to proceed when it determined that the mechanisms of international law were inadequate to the problem it faced. The Lillehammer affair's place in this legacy is particular and permanent. In every assessment of targeted killing programs written since 1973, the killing of Ahmad Bouchiki appears as the essential cautionary case, the demonstration of what happens when the analytical discipline that covert operations require gives way to the operational pressure that they equally generate. The specific failure in Norway was not unique to Mossad, to Israel, or to this period in history. Every intelligence service that has used lethal force covertly has produced wrong target incidents. What distinguishes the Bouchiki killing is the combination of circumstances that made it fully visible. A NATO country's efficient police response, a public trial, convicted intelligence officers, a compensated widow who spent decades speaking about what had been done, and a historical record sufficiently detailed for scholars and journalists to document the failure chain from the unreliable intelligence to the inadequate verification to the killing in a parking lot in a Norwegian town. It stands not as exceptional but as representative of a general truth about programs that operate outside legal constraints. Without external accountability, internal discipline is the only limiting factor, and internal discipline is the thing that fails exactly at the moment when the pressure to produce results is highest. The Munich massacre itself has continued to generate its own historical reckoning, separate from but connected to the story of the operation it triggered. For decades, the International Olympic Committee resisted calls from victim families and various governments for a formal moment of silence at Olympic opening ceremonies in memory of the 11 who were killed in 1972. The reasoning offered was that such a moment would be insufficiently universal, that memorializing the victims of one specific political act among many would create precedents that complicated the Olympics' claimed neutrality. The families disagreed publicly and persistently. Ankie Spitzer in particular articulated the position with a clarity that accumulated force over the decades. The Olympics had continued while her husband and 6 others were bound and waiting in apartments 100 meters from the competition venues, and the institution that had made that choice was being asked to offer a moment of acknowledgement for what that decision had meant. In 2022, at the Tokyo Games' delayed closing and then explicitly at the Munich Games' 50th anniversary commemoration, the IOC finally provided a formal acknowledgement of the 11 dead, 50 years after the fact, at a ceremony that the surviving families attended in a spirit that fell somewhere between resolution and resignation at how long the acknowledgement had been withheld. The Munich Archive has periodically released additional information under various German transparency frameworks, providing researchers and families with documents that had been withheld for decades. Among the most significant disclosures were records indicating that credible intelligence warnings about a potential attack on the Israeli delegation had existed before September 5, 1972, and had been insufficiently acted upon by both German federal and Bavarian state security authorities. The political and legal implications of this disclosure were worked out in German courts and government processes over subsequent years. A compensation agreement with the victim families was announced in 2022, including an acknowledgement of state failure in the security response. The compensation was in the range of 28 million euros, a figure that the families accepted with the pragmatic understanding that it represented a formal official acknowledgement rather than an adequate accounting. The people who built and ran Operation Wrath of God are mostly dead now. Mike Harari died in 2014 at the age of 87, having never given a full public account of his operational command. His general role was reported in various journalistic investigations, but he maintained the organizational discipline of non-confirmation across his entire life. Zvi Zamir, who as Mossad director had overseen the program and authorized its parameters, gave a remarkable interview in 2016 in which he confirmed, with more directness than any previous official Israeli statement, that the program had existed and that it had served the purposes it was designed for. He did not provide operational detail. He did not address Lillehammer. But the confirmation from the man who had authorized the operations was in itself a kind of historical accounting that the record required. The family of Ahmad Bouchiki, the man killed in Norway in July 1973, eventually received that compensation and a degree of official acknowledgement. Whether it constituted justice depends on a definition of justice that the case itself illustrates is very hard to achieve when what was done covertly, in the dark, by people operating under the specific ethical framework of an organization that had decided the world's failure to provide accountability created a vacancy that only it could fill. The 11 Israeli athletes and coaches killed in Munich have not been forgotten, though the nature of how they are remembered has evolved across 50 years from raw national grief toward the particular quality of memory that attaches to events which permanently change something. Their names are on plaques in multiple locations. Their families have lived complete lives in the decades since. Children growing up, grandchildren being born, the ordinary continuation of existence that the men themselves were not able to complete. The widows, when asked in various interviews across the decades what they hoped for, tended to give answers that converged on the same basic thing. That the people who died were remembered as people, not just as a number, not just as the occasion for a geopolitical event. That is what this story has tried to be, an accounting of specific people and specific decisions, specific choices that were made in specific rooms by specific individuals operating under the full weight of what had happened and the full absence of any clean answer about what to do about it. The weight of Munich was real. The inadequacy of conventional accountability was real. The operation that followed was consequential, professionally accomplished in significant measure, morally complex in all measures, finally completed and never fully resolved. Some things cannot be resolved. Some events cut so far through the ordinary fabric of what a civilized world is supposed to guarantee that the cut remains visible no matter what is done in response. Munich was that kind of event. The hunt it triggered was conducted by people who believed, and were not wrong to believe, that accountability mattered and that they were the ones who had to provide it. What they provided was the only kind available. Whether that was enough is a question that settles differently for different people, and probably differently on different days for each of the people in this story who were still alive to ask it.